In 2023, a clay seal no bigger than a thumbnail was excavated from the ruins of a 2700-year-old administrative building in Jerusalem. On it, stamped in ancient Hebrew script, was a name, not a king's name, not a prophet's name, the name of a minor government official. A man mentioned exactly once in the book of Jeremiah, in a single line, as one of the officials who had the prophet Jeremiah thrown into a cistern. His name was Gedaliah son of Pashur, and until that seal was pulled from the ground, there was no evidence outside the Bible that he had ever existed. For over a century, one of the most common criticisms of the Old Testament has been that its characters are too conveniently important, its settings too vague, and its events too dramatic to have been written by people who were actually there. The argument goes that the biblical texts were written centuries after the events they describe, theological reconstructions, not eyewitness accounts. The artifacts keep disagreeing. In the last 2 decades, archaeological finds have produced direct physical corroboration for dozens of biblical figures, events, and locations that were previously considered unverifiable or fictional. These are not symbolic confirmations. They are names, in the right script, in the right place, at the right time. People who appear in the Bible, confirmed by the dirt. The documentary hypothesis, the dominant academic framework for understanding how the Old Testament was composed, holds that the Torah and many of the historical books were assembled from multiple source documents, edited and re-edited over centuries, and reached their final form no earlier than the 6th or 7th century BCE, and in some cases much later. Under this framework, narratives that claim to describe events from the 10th or 9th century BCE were written hundreds of years after the fact by authors who had no direct access to the events they described. This is not a fringe position. It is taught in virtually every accredited seminary and divinity school in the world, and it has significant implications. If the texts were written centuries after the events, the names, details, and political contexts could easily have been invented or distorted. The biblical writers would have been working from oral tradition and earlier written sources of uncertain reliability, not from personal knowledge or eyewitness testimony. For most of the 20th century, the archaeology of the ancient Near East largely seemed to support this skeptical view. Major biblical figures, David, Solomon, the patriarchs, left no trace in the physical record. The kings of Israel and Judah mentioned in the Bible appeared nowhere in Egyptian or Assyrian records, and many of the minor characters who populated the historical narratives, the court officials, the scribes, the administrators, were simply invisible to archaeology entirely. The assumption hardened into something close to consensus. The Bible is a theological document, not a historical one, and the people in it are literary constructs rather than real individuals. Then the seals started turning up. Bullae, small clay seals used to authenticate documents in the ancient world, have been turning up in the antiquities market and in controlled excavations since the late 19th century. For decades, most scholars treated them as interesting artifacts without recognizing their potential as a verification tool for biblical texts. The scholar who changed that was Naaman Avigaad, an Israeli archaeologist and epigrapher at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In the 1970s and 1980s, Avigaad began systematically cataloging ancient Hebrew seals and bullae, many of which had been looted from unknown sites and sold through antiquities dealers. His landmark 1986 publication, Hebrew Bullae from the Time of Jeremiah, presented 255 clay seals dating to the late 7th and early 6th century BCE, the exact period described in the books of Jeremiah, Kings, and Chronicles. What Avigaad found, and what he argued carefully and conservatively, was that a significant number of the names on those seals matched names that appeared in the biblical text, not common names, but specific combinations of personal name and patronym, father's name, that were distinctive enough to make coincidental duplication statistically improbable. In other words, the person named on the seal appeared to be the same person named in the Bible. His most famous identification was a seal reading Berechiyahu son of Neriyahu the scribe, almost certainly Baruch son of Neriah, the personal secretary of the prophet Jeremiah, who appears throughout the book of Jeremiah as his closest associate and the man who transcribed his dictation. The scribe who wrote down Jeremiah's words had left his signature in the clay. Until 1993, there was no archaeological evidence outside the Bible that King David had ever existed. For minimalist scholars, those who argued the biblical narrative of a united Israelite monarchy under David and Solomon was largely fictional, this absence was significant. A king as important as David, they argued, should have left some trace. In July 1993, Archaeologist Avraham Baran was excavating at Tel Dan in northern Israel when his team found a fragment of a black basalt stele, a stone monument, with an Aramaic inscription. The inscription was a victory monument erected by an Aramean king, almost certainly Hazael of Damascus, describing his military victories over the kings of Israel. The inscription contained the phrase "House of David." Baran and his colleague Joseph Neve published the finding in the Israel Exploration Journal. The inscription dated to the 9th century BCE, within 100 years of David's reign. It was the first mention of David outside the Bible, and it confirmed that within a century of his death, foreign kings were referring to the Israelite royal dynasty by his name. The minimalist response was that House of David might not refer to the biblical David. The mainstream archaeological response was that this was the most natural reading of the text, and that the inscription constituted solid external corroboration of a historical Davidic dynasty. Two additional fragments of the same stele were found the following year. Together they confirmed the reading. David was real enough to give his name to a dynasty that foreign enemies identified by it a century after he died. The Book of 2 Kings describes King Hezekiah of Judah, around 700 BCE, ordering the construction of a tunnel to bring water from the Gihon spring inside the walls of Jerusalem in preparation for an Assyrian siege. The tunnel, according to the text, was dug from both ends simultaneously, with the two teams meeting in the middle. The tunnel exists. It was rediscovered in the 19th century and is 533 meters long, carved through solid bedrock. In 1880, a young boy wading in the tunnel found an inscription near the southern end, 6 lines of ancient Hebrew describing the moment the two digging teams broke through to each other. The inscription is now in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. What the Siloam inscription describes matches the biblical account exactly. Two teams digging toward each other, able to hear each other's picks striking the rock, breaking through and meeting at the center. The inscription does not name Hezekiah, but the tunnel's construction date, confirmed by the script style and by subsequent archaeological analysis, places it precisely in the late 8th century BCE, during Hezekiah's reign. In 2005, a team of researchers published a detailed geological and geochemical analysis of the tunnel in Nature, confirming the construction date and the remarkable engineering achievement it represented. The article noted that the tunnel's curvature, long attributed to the workers following a natural crack in the rock, appeared instead to be an intentional design, evidence of coordination and planning between the two teams that would have required more sophisticated communication than previously assumed. The account in 2 Kings was written by someone who knew what they were describing. In 2008, a bulla purchased through the antiquities market in the 1970s and held in a private collection was formally authenticated and published in the Biblical Archaeology Review. The seal read, Berechio, son of Neriyahu the scribe. Berechio is the long form of Baruch. Nariyahu is the long form of Nariah. Baruch, son of Neriah, is mentioned 22 times in the book of Jeremiah. He is described as Jeremiah's personal scribe, the man who wrote down the prophet's dictations, read them publicly in the temple, and preserved the text that eventually became the book of Jeremiah itself. Jeremiah 36 describes Baruch writing down Jeremiah's words from his mouth. A precise description of dictation. The title on the seal, the scribe, matches his role exactly. The patronym matches exactly. The dating of the seal, based on the script style and the clay composition, places it in the late 7th century BCE, precisely when Baruch would have been active. Frank Moore Cross, one of the most respected Hebrew epigraphers of the 20th century, examined the seal and considered the identification certain. Naaman Avogat had identified it years earlier from the same evidence. The man who wrote down the book of Jeremiah left a clay seal with his name on it. It survived 2,600 years. In February 2019, the Israel Antiquities Authority announced the discovery of a seal impression found in excavations at the Ophel, just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The seal was excavated in a controlled, documented dig, not purchased through the antiquities market. It dated to the 8th century BCE. The inscription read, belonging to Isaiah and Neva. The last word is damaged. The final letter or letters are missing. It could read Nivi as an incomplete form of Navi, the Hebrew word for prophet, or it could be a family name. Archaeologist Eilat Mazar, who led the excavation, argued that the seal belonged to the biblical prophet Isaiah, the same Isaiah whose book constitutes one of the longest and most theologically significant works in the Old Testament. The seal was found 10 feet from a seal bearing the name of King Hezekiah of Judah. The king Isaiah is described as advising throughout the book of Isaiah. The identification is not certain. The damaged final word leaves room for doubt, and mainstream archaeologists have been cautious about making the claim definitively. But the proximity to Hezekiah's seal, the matching date, and the matching name make it at minimum a striking coincidence. If it is Isaiah's seal, it is the first physical artifact ever found belonging to a Hebrew prophet. The 2023 excavation at the City of David in Jerusalem that produced the seal of Gedaliah, son of Pashur, was part of a long-running controlled dig that has produced a remarkable sequence of corroborating artifacts. The seal was found in a burnt destruction layer, consistent with the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the event described in the final chapters of 2 Kings in the book of Jeremiah. Gedaliah, son of Pashur, appears in Jeremiah 38:1 as one of 4 officials who heard Jeremiah's prophecy that Jerusalem would fall to Babylon, and who had him thrown into a cistern as punishment for demoralizing the defenders. He is not a major figure. He appears once, in a single verse, as a minor antagonist in a historical scene. He has no theological significance. There is no theological reason to invent him. The seal confirms that he existed, that he held an administrative position, that he was operating in Jerusalem during the late 7th century BCE, and that the author of Jeremiah 38 knew his name, his father's name, and his role. Because the author was describing something real. The archaeologist Yifta Shalev, who directed the excavation, noted that this type of find, a minor official, verifiable by seal, matching a minor detail in the text, is in some ways more compelling than finding the seal of a king. Kings get recorded. Minor officials are only remembered if the account they appear in is accurate. Then the names, details, and political context they describe would be unreliable, not from people who were there. What the seals and inscriptions show is something different. The authors of the biblical text knew minor government officials by their correct names and patronyms. They knew the exact title of a royal scribe. They recorded the name of a man who threw a prophet into a cistern, a man with no theological significance, no symbolic importance, no reason to be remembered unless someone actually saw it happen. That level of specificity is not what you find in texts composed from distant oral tradition. It is what you find in texts composed by people who had access to administrative records, or who were themselves part of the administrative world they describe. Naaman Avigad spent decades making this argument quietly, through the accumulated weight of individual identifications. Each seal alone could be a coincidence. The pattern across dozens of seals is not. Biblical archaeologist Lawrence Stager of Harvard University argued that the concentration of identifiable biblical figures in the Bulle from the late 7th century BCE suggests that the core of the biblical historical narrative, particularly the books of Kings and Jeremiah, was composed by people who were contemporaries of the events, not by later editors reconstructing a distant past. The documentary hypothesis is not wrong about the complexity of the biblical text's composition, but it may have significantly underestimated how much of it was written down early by people who knew what they were talking about. The City of David excavations continue today in one of the most archaeologically active sites in the world. New Bulle, new inscriptions, and new structural finds emerge from the destruction layer of 586 BCE with regularity. Each one is a small piece of the world that the biblical authors described. The world they lived in, they administered, argued about, and ultimately lost when the Babylonians came. The seal of Gedaliah, son of Pashur, sits in a laboratory in Jerusalem right now, waiting for full publication in a peer-reviewed journal. The seal of Baruch, son of Neriah, the man who wrote down the words of Jeremiah, is in a private collection somewhere in the world, its full provenance still uncertain. The Isaiah seal is in the Israel Antiquities Authority's collection, its final letter still missing, still undeciphered. What these objects share is a kind of stubborn materiality. They are not arguments, they are not interpretations. They are clay, pressed with a stamp, fired by accident in a destruction that someone survived long enough to write about. The writing and the clay have been waiting in the same ground for 2,600 years. They match.